welcome everybody. Before we get started, just want to say thanks to all the volunteers as well. We're from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now we live in Redmond, but we used to be very involved with the SQL-Saturdays in Baton Rouge, used to run that, and so we know how much volunteer effort, sweat, time goes into an event like this. The fact that it's all volunteer run makes it special, and so thanks to all the volunteers and thanks for you to joining us. All right, well, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. The recording looks like it has begun, so let's go. Welcome. This is Ethics in Modern Data, Bias, Transparency, and Impact.
My name is Christine Assaf. I am a HR consultant. I actually work at an organization called Archbright as an HR consultant, and my background is that I am a human resources professional, doing everything from leadership development to organizational development, training and development, just all around people strategies for organizations. I'm also in IO psychology. I'm a current grad student with just a few semesters left. If you don't know what IO psychology is, it's basically business psychology. It's a fancy way of saying it. And so basically I just study and do a lot of work and read research around how individuals and groups work with each other in the workplace and how to motivate them and be able to get them to work more efficiently. I'm also a speaker and a trainer and a writer, and I write on a lot of various topics, mostly surrounding people in the workplace and things on like communication, management, leadership, team building, all of those good things.
My name is William Massif. I joined Microsoft on the SQL content team after about 13 years or so as a SQL Server consultant, as a former data platform MVP, all that. So we're both born and raised in Louisiana. We're excited to be speaking to another audience in the South again. Worth noting that while we have citations and our references in the slide deck throughout the presentation, any opinions are our own. And if you have any questions, you can submit them in the chat, and we'll save time at the end to come off of, so that you can come off of mute and do your questions, and we'll queue up answering questions at the end. So thanks again for joining us. Today we're going to be talking a lot about bias in data analytics and data collection, what we can do to recognize our own bias and to fight the perception of bias, and then on how that bias in data has real impacts on society. Without context, without understanding historical or time-based biases, both we and our data findings are just doomed to parrot that bias. So one thing to keep in mind is that most of our examples are going to be based on United States history. We try to be as expository as possible when setting the context here. We talk about other examples internationally sometimes. Again, if you have any questions, we're open to requests for clarification, questions at the end of the presentation. And we're going to make these slides available. You'll be able to find all our references and citations in the notes at the bottom of each slide. Finally, this is one of my favorite webcomic series, Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, with a take on why the robot uprising used spears and rocks, an example of historical time-based bias.
So if trained on data which contains human bias, then of course our data outcomes will learn that bias. Or worse, they're likely to amplify it, institutionalize it, and mask it in the trustworthiness of an algorithm. Laura Douglas, who's an AI researcher, defines bias as, bias is an inaccuracy which is systemically incorrect in the same direction. Many algorithms which are trained to do a human job will have been trained on human-generated data. This is a huge problem, especially if people assume that algorithms are impartial and can't hold the same biases as people do. This presentation is about acknowledging both the public's perception of trustworthiness of statistical analysis and our responsibilities as data professionals and developers and analysts. This presentation is about our ethical responsibilities as data professionals to become aware of bias and to acknowledge it and to be accountable for it. So here's an example of bias. This is from Google Translate. And if you look here, you can see he is nurse and she is doctor. But if you reverse the translation, the gendered language is then reversed, and then the gender norms are reinforced here. Biases like this are live on display in the wild. You can try it for yourself with a number of languages. It works for Hungarian and for Turkish to English translation. And this is only helping to further society's implicit biases. And in this case, it would be gender norms in professions. In fact, in translations to and from many European languages, the concept of female doctor or historian is just unknown to Google Translate. Out of 20 translations of female doctor, none were correct. And out of 20 references to male nurse, only 7 were correctly translated. Without awareness of historical bias or in source data, you will present unethical findings at best. Bias exists, and it must be identified and acknowledged. Conclusions drawn based on biased data without caveats or statistical controls and any historical context, it may be highly unethical. So let's look at some more examples of that.
So this discusses Major League Baseball. Through the widespread use of steroids in the 90s and early 2000s, there were many new home run records that were set. And there was a significant increase in players who hit more than 40 home runs in a single season during the steroid era compared to before and after. And though steroids were banned in Major League Baseball in 1991, the league did not implement league-wide testing for performance-enhancing drugs until 2003. So the top 6 single seasons for home runs in history were all between 1998 and 2001, and all by 3 players, Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, and Sammy Sosa. So this knowledge of their actions affects our historical analysis of training techniques, scouting and coaching, Hall of Fame eligibility, long-term player health, player compensation, even ballpark batting statistics. And so we must ethically consider and discuss in our findings the illegal player behavior during the legal and unmonitored steroid era in baseball. Okay, that was a softball. Let's dive into a more difficult subject. So in the United States, the Comstock laws, in effect from 1873 to 1957, had widespread and lasting cultural impact, banning obscene, lewd, or lascivious materials. Mid-20th century libraries experienced cultural censorship of racism, sexism, nudity, religion, and evolution. In fact, the American Library Association in 1984, quote, discerned a continuing pattern of suppression from information from the government. In the 1980s, the Reagan era ushered in a new push to libraries, school boards, and government agencies to censor books. And the media almost invariably yields to this pressure, establishes some sort of code of self-regulation in a sense of self-preservation. So this knowledge affects our analysis of all sorts of things like book publications and sales, readership, popularity, the public sentiment, and even sociological trends. And even our trademark conversations must be aware of, quote, censorship placed on the industry from religious groups, patriots, unions, private businesses, and of course the government. Just because publications weren't sold or available doesn't mean the publications didn't exist or that there wasn't public interest in them. And by the way, the Comstock laws also prohibited the mailing and sale of contraceptives. And it was not until 1972 that the United States Supreme Court legalized birth control for all citizens, irrespective of marital status. So this knowledge affects our historical data sources on all sorts of American data, like birth rates, reproductive health history, family planning choices, family size preference, even our foreign aid policy and public health policy. One more example. So there is significant historical and modern day evidence for race-based bias in federal judicial sentencing. A 1992 review revealed both ethnic and gender biases in sentencing where judges have discretion, but no bias where discretion is limited. Another 2014 study found that sentences for black males in the federal system are nearly 20% longer than those for white males convicted of similar crimes. And the data speak to two different potential causes. The first is the Supreme Court cases United States versus Booker and Gall versus United States that gave federal judges more discretion on sentencing. And then second, studies found bias in prosecutorial discretion, that is, decisions on who to charge and with what severity of charges. So bias in both sentencing discretion by judges and prosecutorial discretion by attorneys general contribute to outcomes resulting in racial disparities in our criminal justice system, perhaps accounting for a judge's discretion. Quote, charges with mandatory minimums are disproportionately charged against black defendants. So, our analysis of severity and length of sentencing, acquittals, prosecutorial effectiveness, evidence collection, interrogation techniques, all must take into account the biased outcomes on race. And this isn't the first time we're going to talk about outcomes today. Our analysis of this data without historical context would only reinforce and institutionalize historical racial bias. Drawing conclusions from this data without context of legal racial segregation and discrimination in the United States in the 20th century, for example, would be highly unethical.
So, how do we go about identifying and overcoming bias? Data collection is usually provided to us through real-world interactions, which means it may contain real-world bias. No data exists in a vacuum. Now, understand that bias in data collection and analysis may be inevitable, but it's not acceptable. It's not your responsibility to end bias, though that's a worthy cause, but rather to be aware of it. You have an ethical responsibility to acknowledge and control for and not further bias. Look at bias as outcomes, not as intents or origins. Outcomes are how bias is measured. The world doesn't really care if we intended to be unbiased. It just cares whether or not we were or were not biased. So it's really all about the outcome. Part of our ethical responsibility is looking at our methodologies and processes with data and knowing that it's statistically accurate or inaccurate. So let's look at some statistics 101 here. And first, we're going to start with some easy things. What is validity and what is reliability? Validity is the extent to which a concept or a conclusion or a measurement is well-founded, that it likely corresponds to something accurate out in the real world. Valid is actually Latin to mean strong, or derives from Latin to mean strong. And that basically means we're pretty sure that this thing is not just made up, that it actually exists out there in the world. It tells a story of something true. But more importantly, validity means that we sought out to answer a question, to hit the bullseye, and that we're pretty sure this data, this system, this analysis answers that real world question. Now, reliability is all about consistency. It's basically like, we can do this test, we can run this system, we can predict that this thing is happening over and over again, and we know it to be true. It's like saying, I have confidence in the results here. So how do we prove something that we've gathered is both valid and reliable? You do this through hypothesis testing. And that typically means that we formulate a hypothesis, we collect the data, we analyze that data to test the hypothesis, and then we draw our conclusions. But if our data is skewed, our analysis will also be skewed. And then we may draw incorrect conclusions. So to put it another way, if our collection methods lacked credibility and our analysis fails to see all of the variables that are in our data, can we truly say that our data was valid or reliable? Or our conclusions rather. But how can we overcome what we don't know? So there's a few ways, really. You can have independent verification by consultants or business entities, subject matter experts who have outside perspectives, having a third-party analysis look at everything that you're doing, or simply just having more diversity of thought in your analysis, which means including people on teams who have different life experiences than our own. who can give us more insights into the variables that maybe we have missed. Brad Smith with Microsoft once wrote this: "It's difficult to build technology that serves the world without first building a team that reflects the diversity of the world. A more diverse group of researchers and engineers is more likely to recognize and think harder about bias problems that may even impact them personally. In IT, we know we need complex teams to solve complex problems, and we know that diverse teams are more productive." So let's look at some more examples of bias. Now, this isn't the first time we're going to mention facial recognition products in this presentation. We're going to talk about it a bit more. But in January of 2020, in the United Kingdom, 81% of people identified as suspects by the Metropolitan Police facial recognition technology were, in fact, innocent. Also, this same technology falsely identified African American and Asian faces 10 to 100 times more often than white faces. In a 2018 test of Amazon's recognition computer platform, 28 members of US Congress were incorrectly matched as other people who had been arrested for a crime. Without validity or reliability, is it ethical to use facial recognition software that has pervasive access to public camera systems? And do we think that law enforcement would be transparent and open about the flaws in such a system? So let's talk more about that need for transparency. Many Americans are familiar with the ACT test. That's an exam that most 18-year-olds take as part of a college application process. Now, ACT has long since stated that the test measures what students learned in school, which means they believe it's valid, and that the repeated testing, if a student takes it over and over again, that they're going to get similar results, which means that it's reliable. However, in 2016, ACT admitted that family income is a major factor on this test. There is a 3 to 4 point difference between students in poorer versus richer households, and that line being about $80,000 per year. And that gap is widening according to their own data. Now, credit to ACT for disclosing this research here, which shows that widening gap among students based on that family income. And later, they tried to explain that this gap is indicating that lower income students also had lower high school GPAs and less rigorous coursework. Now, again, credit to them for at least acknowledging this, but is ACT ethically testing for high school achievement or for opportunity? If our measurements are valid and reliable, but our outcomes are rejected, shouldn't we challenge the testing here? Our results are valid as tested, but what about the outcomes? Are they ethical? Are they to be trusted as the result of an impartial algorithm? In this ACT example, socioeconomic level is the variable and it affects the outcome. There may be some other variables that affect the ACT student score. Tutoring, homeschooling, if they went to public school or private school, the number of miles the student lives from a large city, the amount of sleep that the student got the night before the exam, the number of hours that they work a part-time job. There's so many. Now, recently, more than 1,000 institutions of higher learning have adopted a test optional admissions policy, meaning that they're no longer asking for the ACT or the SAT on their applications. Now, this might question the validity of ACT's test in terms of what colleges want out of that score, given that so many schools are now disregarding its validity. And an overwhelming amount of studies that have been done say the ACT does not actually predict college graduation outcomes. In fact, the biggest factor that impacts graduation outcomes remains household income. So I think, why don't we just toss out, that and just accept all the students who only have higher household incomes? We can just do that.
It would not be ethical.
So, knowing the variables that are involved in your analysis is important, just as we saw with the ACT. When conducting analysis, most researchers will review, identify, and map out all of the variables. So let's briefly go through some definitions of some variables, and then I'll give you an example that's going to make this much clearer. First, understand that mediators and confounders are similar, except except for the effect or direction that they have on the exposure and the outcome, right? Mediators are considered to be kind of that causal pathway between the exposure and the outcome, which means they kind of naturally occur. Now, confounders directly affect both the exposure and the outcome. They go to both. Moderators are simply interactions that change the size or the direction of the effect of the exposure on the outcome. It makes the outcome smaller or larger. And covariates are just variables that might affect the outcomes, but they're not really associated with anything else. So you will never find the variables unless you're looking for them. You have to ask yourself, are there variables that may affect the data? There will always be variables made apparent when you start to dig. And sometimes you kind of never see them until after your data is collected and is complete. So let's look at this example. So we're going to look at the relationship here between poor mothers, which is shown here as maternal deprivation, and low birth weight. Now, we know this to be true. Maternal deprivation, poor mothers, tend to give birth to babies with lower birth weight. It's been tested over and over again, and this is based on a study to investigate these trends in birth rates by socioeconomic deprivation and maternal age in England, and the study was from 1997 to 2008. But why? What are the variables that surround this? Let's take a look at those. So mediator here is diet. Now remember, mediator was that causal pathway. It's said to kind of be naturally occurring. And in this case, diet could be just to being poor. And a suboptimal diet of the mother who is nourishing an unborn child means that that baby would likely be smaller. Usually a mediator variable is something that you can't avoid in your data. It just exists and you need to be aware of it. Now, confounder is a variable, it is going to be age here. Remember, the confounders affect both the exposure, the poor mothers, and the outcome, that low birth weight. Now, in our analysis, maternal age may affect poverty. So perhaps the younger a mother is, the less money she has, or just she could be less physically developed than an older adult woman. And therefore, her age may be associated with low birth weight. This variable, though, could be controlled for. We could ask for mothers only of a certain ages. Remember, the moderator affects the size or direction of our outcome. In this case, the moderator is smoking. There's an interaction between poor mothers and smoke exposure on birth weight, meaning that poor mothers tend to smoke, which produce babies even smaller. And again, we could control for this if we wanted to. We could look at the data for mothers who don't smoke, or only for those who do. And then lastly, our covariate here is height. Now remember, this variable is for things we need to account for because we think they're related to the outcome, but they're not really connected to anything else. Height here could be a factor, but it doesn't really affect the exposure, but maybe the outcome. And again, this would be a variable we could control for in the experiment, but maybe we are not able to. And this brings up a great point. When you're presented with data, you may or may not have the ability to control for your variables. Can you remove some variables and not others? And how do you choose which variables to account for? And then what's the reasoning behind that decision? Clearly describing where we think or predict the interactions and the relationships and the pathways in our data and in our work is incredibly powerful. Mapping and reviewing and analyzing our data for all the variables that could bias our data can help in mitigating that bias.
So let's talk about transparency as part of overcoming bias. So here's an example in the United States where political pollsters may have altered their data to fit the competition. So in a study by the website 538, non-traditional pollsters, a non-traditional pollster in this case is like an online automated survey or an automated system. They were allegedly caught cheating by peeking at a, quote, gold standard poll. And a gold standard poll in political polling is a live person-to-person phone call. So non-traditional political polls were mysteriously more accurate when there was a gold standard poll in the same election, and they were less accurate when there was no more expensive gold standard poll performed. So when there was a gold standard poll in the election, the non-traditional polls were more accurate, and for a small election that no one really gave much attention to, the non-traditional polls were less accurate. So this is a picture here of the crosstabs of a political poll, of an example. A detailed data table of the polling results per question, per demographic breakdown. A common response to big or sensational headlines about political poll results should always be, show me the crosstabs. Transparency should include not only the crosstabs of your results, but a disclosure and a discussion of known historical biases. Your data tells a story. There may be a tendency to want to manipulate the data to fit the story that wants to be told. How can you, quote, show the crosstabs, show the detail and the proof in your work?
This is a quote from an NIH study that says, every scientist should therefore be aware of all potential sources of bias. If deviation is still present, authors should confess it in their articles by declaring the known limitation of their work. Failure to provide that transparency begs accusations of a biased interpretation. Now, let's look at an example with biased outcomes and no transparency. In 2019, Apple issued credit cards, and men were given higher credit limits than women, even higher than their wives. Now, how could this be? Maybe could women's income inequality be a variable? If you look at women's income inequality, that provides a historically biased look on gender. A quote from Wired magazine said, "No one from Apple seemed able to describe how the algorithm even worked, let alone justify its output. While Goldman Sachs, the issuing bank for the Apple Card, insisted that there isn't any gender bias in the algorithm, it failed to offer proof." This is an example of Apple not even being aware of their bias, much less disclosing it publicly, which would have been embarrassing. Apple is now being investigated by regulators, so these kind of errors may result in legal implications. And one could be challenged on disparate impact, particularly in employment areas. And we'll talk about disparate impact a bit later. You need to be able to support your conclusions. That's why we're talking about steroids and censorship and race and facial recognition and these Apple cards. Transparency on how the algorithm works, at least internally, in case of competitive intellectual property, is key to acknowledging bias in outcomes.
So let's dive deeper into this ethical problem. We've talked about transparency in analysis. Let's talk about the ethics of data collection. So this is from a report from the White House in 2014. The keys here are that 1, data will be collected on individuals, and 2, that data will not be owned by those individuals. So what are our ethical responsibilities in collection and ownership of citizen data? Let's go over a couple of bad examples. You may be familiar with the story about American retailer Target's direct mail campaign for expectant mothers and a furious dad who did not know his teenage daughter was pregnant yet. This quote is from Andrew Pohl, the Target statistician who developed the store's model for predicting and detecting consumer pregnancies, which were then used to target ads to expectant mothers. We're very conservative about compliance with all privacy laws, but even when you're following the law, you can do things where people get queasy. Ethical collection, unethical use, resulting in a violation of privacy for a sensitive topic. What if this ad arrived shortly after a miscarriage, for example? It'd be different if Target were, say, sending mailers to people about to buy shoes or school supplies or a car, but a pregnancy? Pohl says that even if you're following the privacy laws and regulations, you may still trip over ethical lines. Let's look at another example. The British firm Cambridge Analytica gathered data on 87 million Facebook users without their consent via what Facebook would later label malicious use of its developer system. Any user who took Cambridge Analytica's custom Facebook personality quiz also unknowingly allowed Cambridge Analytica to access their personal data and the personal data including location for all of their friends and connections in Facebook. Clearly, unethical collection. Cambridge Analytica then used the data to perform digital operations to target future President Trump's 2016 campaign messaging, using, quote, 5,000 points of data on every voter to set the campaign's travel schedule, the platform, to micro-target Facebook users with $1 million a day in ads. Maybe that's not unethical use, but it was based on unethically collected data. These quotes are from Cambridge Analytica data analyst Christopher Wiley, who turned whistleblower and testified in both the United States and the United Kingdom in 2018. Cambridge Analytica later would share that Facebook data with Russian proxies for, quote, rumor campaigns, attitudinal inoculation, and psychological warfare. Wiley, when he worked at Cambridge Analytica, did not believe that their collection and analysis was unethical. He does believe it was unethical now. So analysts must be aware of consent mechanisms, both how they were collected and more logistically, how this data on consent can be incorporated into your future analysis. So for example, where is it recorded that users signed off on the privacy policy? Can we filter our data set on only those who have signed off? Where is it recorded that participants asked to be contacted in the future or placed on a do not call list? Are we transparent about our data, use, and potential reuse? Does our approach rely on consumers being gullible or tricking consumers? So let's talk more about that potential reuse of data. Control creep refers to data that has been generated with a particular purpose in mind, but is then repurposed. Can you think of a genetic data example that has been identified as having a disparate impact that is now federally banned in the US for use in hiring? So for example, users in the United States used genetic screening in the 1970s to identify potential employees who carried a gene mutation for sickle cell anemia, a very expensive and periodically debilitating genetic disorder that is predominant in African Americans. So those carrying this specific gene mutation were denied jobs, even though many of them were healthy and would never develop the disease. In the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 put an end to sickle cell trait discrimination in employment and its disparate outcomes on race. In the UK, the Equality Act of 2010 provided for the same protections. And now you will likely see a flyer for this in your break room at work talking about a prohibition on sickle cell trait discrimination. Similarly, a genetic test for expensive cancers must not be a prerequisite to joining an employer's healthcare coverage. That would be unethical. As personal health data services and devices become more prevalent in our society, let's be aware of potential misuse and discrimination based on predictive healthcare markers. So using financial data for healthcare research is potentially predatory and discriminatory, and vice versa, where potentially only wealthy patients are told about the best and most expensive treatments. This also leads to a relatively new concept of weblining, or the use of financial data to target users online for ads, including things like childcare, housing, and healthcare. This is a play of words on redlining, which we'll talk more about soon. Financial data may be predatory if lower income consumers are targeted with subprime lending, high interest credit cards, or high fee banking. We must be aware and transparent of potential control creep in the data that we control.
We'll talk more about weblining later because it can contribute to digitizing a disparate impact. We mentioned this earlier with the Apple Card algorithm having a disparate impact on women of facial recognition's disparate impact on darker skinned individuals too. Most systems, particularly selection systems, are built to intend to discriminate, meaning that they are created to create distinctions among people. And let me repeat that. Most systems, like selection systems for employment, are built to intend to discriminate, to create those distinctions among people. But there's various laws about discrimination on the basis of age, gender, race, etc. And these laws are most notably around employment, housing, and public accommodation. In the United States, for example, there are two forms of illegal discrimination. The first is disparate treatment. Now, that's active discrimination towards individuals. It's intentional, it's open, it's retaliatory, and very exclusionary. But disparate or adverse impact, that's kind of a passive discrimination. It's usually towards groups and individuals, and you're sometimes unaware that it exists in your system. In the case of housing discrimination, the doctrine of disparate impact recognizes that implicit biases can produce discriminatory results, even without intent, and allows for such results to be remedied. Analytical models or predictive models must either account for and be aware of past trends or become guilty of continuing and institutionalizing those past trends. Your data analysis must expose and control for disparate impact, or you will contribute to it.
So a brief history of redlining, a term used in the United States and Canada to describe once legal housing segregation. Red lines were literally drawn on maps around, quote, undesirable minority neighborhoods, marking them as undesirable or hazardous for financing. This denied federal housing authority insured mortgages to minority families. Literally, legalized disparate impact by the FHA. Many of you as young people may have used an FHA subsidized loan to make your first home purchase. We did. In the 1930s, the FHA surveyed neighborhoods in 239 cities, color-coded them green for best, blue for still desirable, yellow for definitely declining, and red for hazardous. These redlined areas were the ones local lenders would consider unsuitable for investment because of the residents' racial or ethnic demographics. So this is an actual redlining map from 1937 in Philadelphia. Maps like this were used throughout the country, and it really wasn't undone in the United States until a series of laws in the 1970s required banks to meet the lending needs of low-income neighborhoods. So the American dream of home ownership was denied to the baby boomer minorities legally through the 1970s. And that generational gap continues today. 50 years later, 3 out of 4 neighborhoods redlined on government maps 80 years ago continue to struggle economically today. And despite laws in place, the disparate racial outcomes continue in housing. Quote, 50 years after the Federal Fair Housing Act, African Americans and Latinos continue to be routinely denied conventional mortgage loans at rates far higher than their white counterparts. This is a racial dot map from my hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It shows racial demographic data from the 2010 census. See if you can spot Florida Boulevard on this map, a historical redlining boundary. If you're a bank, your analysis on market segmentation may be furthering historical racial housing segregation. If you're ignoring minority areas for special loan rate offers, ATM locations, service locations, your assessments, etc. Even if you aren't intending to exclude minorities from your financial services, by ignoring 85 years of racial subdividing, you may be extending that historical trend. If, say, despite your best intentions, your outcome was that 80% of your mortgages were written to whites in a majority black city like Baton Rouge, your bank could only be judged by its outcomes, not by your best intentions.
Only outcomes can measure disparate impact. Disparate impact is not based on intentions. It is not legal for companies to blame their algorithm to avoid penalties. There are decades of legal precedent, most recently upheld by the Supreme Court in 2015, that permit the use of statistical analysis to identify patterns of discrimination, but not excuse it. We've discussed disparate impact in housing. Now let's talk about a more modern online example. Weblining, or digital redlining, is the segmentation of consumer data based on income. This may result in disparate exposure to online ads and services, like in childcare, housing, or healthcare. Social sorting is the coding and classifying of aggregate data, and social sorting affects both choices and opportunities of profiled individuals. So Facebook, for example, was investigated for allowing housing ads to target based on religion, race, gender, disability, etc. This allowed for obvious housing discrimination, which is already illegal. Another example is a study that found that Google's online ad delivery was featuring the headline, "Have you ever been arrested?" And this headline was sent more frequently to racially black sounding names than to white sounding names.
Another example of disparate impact in a pretty clear case of a bad outcome of an algorithm. In 2017, thousands of disabled or elderly in the state of Arkansas lost their Medicaid funding for life-critical in-home caregivers. Perhaps the cuts were unintentional at first. They were also unannounced, implemented without caution or review for this disparate impact, and then they were defended by the state for years because it saved a lot of money. Even once, the state was held in contempt by a judge for continuing to use the algorithm. Eventually, the state legislature made permanent the benefit cuts after a lengthy court battle. The algorithm won. This is a cautionary tale that speaks to the lack of due process and transparency in a decision and then blindly trusting in an algorithm's decision. If transparency and mitigating bias are our goals, then we must review the outcomes and strive for that transparency. In another case, 3 different commercial AI products from IBM, Microsoft, and Face++ also used skewed data samples that overrepresented lighter-skinned males and vastly underrepresented and therefore underperformed when trying to identify women or people with darker skin. In a simpler example based on sample representation, suppose you decide to estimate the average height of a human by using data from professional basketball players. Since basketball players are taller than average, your sample will not be representative of the population, and your data is biased at the time of collection. Bias is often less obvious to detect. As we see in the commercial AI facial recognition products, what if that bias is allowed to progress all the way through the development of the machine learning model to deployment in the field? In an MIT study, in the same MIT study, the task of identifying the gender of African and European Parliament members, the platforms showed a 1/3 failure rate. For MIT researcher and computer scientist Joy Buolamwini, who is Black, her face was not detected. And there is now a Netflix documentary on her work at MIT and on her study called Coded Bias. You may be interested in viewing that. The documentary is called Coded Bias. This is a common issue for my Black colleagues and for many Black students forced online around the world during the pandemic. Cameras aren't recognizing them, and modern algorithms aren't trained to detect darker skinned faces. An FBI co-authored study indicates that facial recognition software is less accurate on darker skin. Similarly, personal voice assistants like Google Home and Amazon's Alexa struggle with Black voices. Speech recognition algorithms disproportionately misunderstand Black speakers, probably for the same reasons: poorly sampled source data. So when this type of facial recognition is used in law enforcement, and is less accurate on darker-skinned citizens, the potential, if not inevitability, for a civil rights disaster is high. In fact, it's already happened. Let's talk about two examples, one highly specific and one broadly affecting people of color. So in January 2020, a black man, Robert Williams, was arrested on his front lawn in a suburb of Detroit after police scanned state driver's license photos and matched his to grainy surveillance camera footage. He was innocent. In the lawsuit surrounding Robert Williams, the Detroit chief of police admitted in June 2020 that 96% of the time the facial recognition software would misidentify suspects. Credit the Detroit chief of police with uncommon transparency there. In 2019, a complaint was brought before the Federal Trade Commission about HireVue, a virtual interview AI service to determine, quote, employability by processing your facial movements during an interview. HireVue has over 700 corporate customers, including major companies like IKEA, Hilton, Oracle, and the Dow Jones. HireVue's predictive algorithm plays games with candidates to get insights into attention and cognition skills, entirely based on facial recognition and response times. The company even told the Washington Post that their proprietary interview algorithms are kept hidden from clients and candidates, both to protect trade secrets, but also, to quote, the company doesn't always know how the system decides. This type of application of facial recognition has profound ethical issues, not only for its potential for disparate impact on people of color, but a total lack of transparency into how it scans faces. Some researchers have labeled this application of facial recognition as pseudoscience, a 21st century version of snake oil. All these examples of facial recognition, our last big topic for the day, raise ethical red flags not only about the technology claiming to accomplish the impossible, but a growing lack of transparency as to how the technology was working. Lawsuits against facial recognition software platforms have been brought by multiple governments and states. Facebook recently settled a lawsuit with Illinois consumers, which claimed the company illegally collected and stored biometric data on millions of users without their consent. In late January 2021, Amnesty International launched its Ban the Scan initiative that calls for a total ban on facial recognition technology by police and government agencies. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation advocates for bans on government use of facial recognition tech while protecting private research and development. Some governments are listening. So quick rundown of where facial recognition is being banned or boosted. At least 20 major US cities and 6 states have halted or limited government use of facial recognition technology. Worldwide, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Morocco have publicly opposed facial recognition software. However, the use of facial recognition has exploded in China, Russia, Israel, Kazakhstan, and other countries for use by police, surveillance, even public transportation, and COVID-19 protocol enforcement. China remains the world's foremost and most notorious player in facial recognition and is aggressively exporting its technology. Look for more news in this space as the use of facial recognition expands in a variety of industries, and while governments and regulators often react too slowly to protect civil liberties and privacy.
So we know what bias is, we know what it looks like, we know how bias can create problems for ethical collection and analysis. We know how to look for ethical collection and analysis by understanding disparate impact. And we know that disparate impact doesn't care about your intentions. So what kind of questions can we ask of ourselves and our teams to avoid ethical pitfalls in data analysis and in collection? First, how anonymous is our data? Do we have the citizen's consent implicitly or explicitly for the level of anonymity that we have collected? Second, who has access to the data internally? Who has access to the data externally? And does the citizen have access? Is that access revocable? Also, legally, what's the regulatory environment that the citizen exists in? What are our responsibilities and potential liabilities, like GDPR in Europe or the California Consumer Privacy Act? And then, is our data trustworthy? Are its biases understood? Do we have enough context to understand the potential outcomes?
So when we presented this same topic in May of last year at a virtual conference in Europe, we were asked somewhat incredulously if we were in favor of the regulation of software development. And frankly, yes. Engineers who make bridges need regulated licensing because we don't want bridges collapsing. Doctors need board certifications to ensure that people get evidence-based medical care. General contractors need a license and a bond to build a house because we don't want houses collapsing for preventable reasons. From the Therac 25 software bug that caused patients in the 1980s to be inadvertently megadosed with radiation, to the Boeing 737 MAX, and carrying that legacy into an emerging marketplace of machine learning solutions, perhaps we as data professionals specifically, and software developers generally, we do need some regulation, or at least ethical commitment to practice. So Oren Etzioni, the CEO of the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence and a professor at the University of Washington, has proposed just this: a modified version of a medical doctor's Hippocratic oath, the oath sworn by generations of doctors to do no harm, etc. He proposed a Hippocratic oath for artificial intelligence practitioners, which is 11 sentences, but this is at the heart of it. I will consider the impact of my work on fairness in both perpetuating historical biases, which is caused by the blind extrapolation from past data to future predictions, and in creating new conditions that increase economic or other inequality. We could not agree more. Colin Allen, a researcher in cognitive science and history, said just as we can envisage machines with increasing degrees of autonomy from human oversight, we can envisage machines whose controls involve increasing degrees of sensitivity to things that matter ethically. Not perfect machines, to be sure, but better. And if we were to sum up the last hour, and thank you for joining us, about how you can mitigate bias and perform data analytics ethically, it's very simple. When you know better, do better. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope you've had a great Data Geeks, and you have a great remainder of the conference. And right now, it looks like we have about 8 minutes left, and we are open to questions. You can come off of mute, or you can put them in the chat. And thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Will and Christine. Awesome presentation. I want to use another Hollywood's sentence that is not related to the Back to the Future, but I think that with a great power, you get a lot of responsibility, right?
That's right.
It's also a very, yes.
That's right. That's Uncle Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
Spider-Man's Uncle Ben.
Yeah,
that's right.
Trying to think of the name of the uncle. Yeah. That's right. I think sometimes we as data professionals, especially if you're in a, in one of the fields and industries that we talked about today, banking, healthcare, stuff that uses facial recognition, I think that people who are in those industries need to be more aware of perhaps the power they have over data and the real impacts on society that can come of this. And I think we provided a lot of examples ripped from the headlines recently about where maybe the data professionals like me and you don't always keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm. I think also there's something to be said about we're always kind of wanting to be on the cutting edge. We're always wanting to innovate, to create something new, to create something different, to be the first to market on things. And that's great. That's important because these technologies become the next best thing, and it all makes our lives way better, right? But at the same time, we have to be very, very careful as we maneuver. And sometimes I think it's just a little bit of slow our roll, and make sure that we're getting some other people to scrutinize our work. And I can't emphasize that enough. as a researcher, as a person who does a lot of this work on the back end from case studies and employment data research, the scrutiny of your work is powerful because that allows you, even if you do have some situation where you can't mitigate that bias, at least you're able to provide the information that says, hey, we knew it. We knew it ahead of time. We knew when we went to deployment in the field because we had somebody come in and point that out to us. And then we tried to do the best that we could up to that point. Yeah. And that's really where the solution finding happens. So I think that, and I know that's tough with intellectual property where you want to kind of keep things under wraps, especially, for those innovative technologies that come out, but really needing to do that internally when we can.
Excellent. Couldn't agree more. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, William, Christine.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
At this time, I will